With Israel's fourth election in 2 years just a few days away, we wanted to share with you some of the latest developments in what's gearing up to be a very tight race. Exactly how the parties are placed a week out remains unclear, and it seems like a few possible outcomes are still in play. What is somewhat more certain, though, is that the bloc of right-wing and ultra-Orthodox parties will dominate the Knesset, holding as many as 2/3 of the seats. The question then is, how exactly can a coalition be formed, and with which parties? The Knesset is 120 seats, so a coalition needs to muster 61 seats to form a government. The major polls have most parties within a pretty tight band, so we'll just take one, last week's Channel 12 poll, to give you a sense of how things are playing out. Despite almost a year of street protests against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his trial on corruption charges beginning in a Jerusalem courtroom, his Likud party is still predicted to win the largest number of seats, with 28. He's down pretty significantly, though, from the 37 that he currently holds. Next on the list are former Finance Minister Yair Lapid. His party's on 19, consistent with his recent boost to be number 2 in most polls, followed by former Defence Minister Naftali Bennett with his Yamina party on 13, Likud defector Gidon Saar's New Hope party on 11, and the joint list, representing largely Israel's Arab citizens, on 9 seats. Netanyahu's current coalition partners, the Blue and White Party, are at the other end of the poll, teetering on the edge of failing to cross the threshold. They're only predicted to get 4 seats, punished by voters who feel that leader Benny Gantz sold them out by joining a Likud government. 2 other parties near the threshold are the left-wing party Meretz and the far-right religious Zionism party, both of which only barely cross the threshold of 3.25% of all votes. And this is where coalition building starts to get interesting. Even though right-wing, ultra-Orthodox and nationalist parties have a significant majority, 78 seats according to this poll, the dividing line this time isn't between left and right, and it isn't between religious and secular. Instead, it's between those who unconditionally back Netanyahu as Prime Minister and those who don't. And that's where things get difficult for Netanyahu, as parties which are his natural ideological allies, like Gidon Saar's New Hope and Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu parties, they've said they won't join a government that he leads. Also coming into play in the coalition negotiations will be whether parties with only limited support, like Meretz and religious Zionism and Blue and White and the Islamist Ram party, whether or not they end up crossing the threshold. That could make things either a lot easier or a lot harder for Netanyahu. For example, if the religious Zionism party makes it in, but Meretz and Blue and White don't, the math gets a lot easier for Netanyahu. But if religious Zionism fails where Meretz succeeds, then it's probably all but impossible for him to get the numbers. Of course, if both fail or both succeed, they tend to balance each other out. Ultimately, it could be a matter of just 10 or 20,000 votes either way, which decides whether Netanyahu has an easy way to stay as Prime Minister, someone new gets sworn in, or whether the system is deadlocked again and yet another election is scheduled. But even if an anti-Bibi bloc is able to form a majority, it will be a disparate group which shares little but their antipathy for Netanyahu. It's hard to see them making meaningful policy strides on almost any issue, from solving the conflict with the Palestinians to helping the economy recover post-COVID. It's also worth taking a moment to focus on perhaps the most controversial party with a chance to make it into the Knesset, and that's the religious Zionism party's Jewish Power faction led by Itamar Ben-Gvir. It was Netanyahu himself who engineered the deal to have the 2 factions run together because he didn't want to waste any right-wing votes. But it's important to understand exactly who the Jewish Power Party is. The ideological descendants of racist rabbi and former Knesset member Meir Kahane, Ben-Gvir has openly called for the expulsion of disloyal Arab-Israeli citizens and has been called the go-to man for Jewish extremists facing legal battles. Until recently, he had a portrait in his office of Jewish mass murderer Baruch Goldstein, the perpetrator of the 1994 massacre in Hebron, which killed 29 Muslim worshippers. Kahanists regularly use and threaten violence to realize their aims of Jewish supremacy. And it's this party which Netanyahu not only ensured was brought into a coalition to secure right-wing votes, but with which he also signed a so-called surplus vote-sharing agreement, effectively tying his electoral fortunes to theirs. Now, Netanyahu said that Ben-Gvir would be a part of his coalition, but that he was not fit to be a minister or head a Knesset committee or have any other position of influence. But of course, it didn't stop him courting their votes or signing the vote-sharing deal with Ben-Gvir's party. Ultimately, this election may come down to who doesn't vote rather than who does. In last year's election, turnout was more than 70%, making it one of the highest turnout elections in more than 20 years. This year, of course, there's the unique challenge of figuring out how to give everyone an opportunity to vote. There are, for example, close to 200,000 Israelis in home isolation, having been diagnosed with COVID-19 or recently returned from overseas and serving a quarantine period. Israel doesn't have absentee or mail voting, so election officials have created an additional 4,000 polling stations to help ease crowding, even converting buses into polling points. It's hard to know where turnout will be. On the one hand, it's hard to not think that 4 elections in 2 years creates a sense of despair. But on the other, because of the current COVID travel restrictions, there are more Israelis actually in Israel than usual. Then again, if the 23rd of March is a sunny day, don't be surprised if people end up voting to just go to the beach instead. That's all from us now until the election itself. Remember, NIF's a non-partisan organisation, and we don't support or oppose anyone in any election, but we do hope that these videos give you just a small snapshot of what's happening on the ground. So stay tuned to our social media feeds for an update on the results as they come in, and a special event with some well-placed analysts and journalists to help us process the results after the election. For now, stay safe, and thanks for watching.